So I think we're good. We're gonna start right now. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I hope we are in a good shape in these difficult times. So on behalf of Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS Indonesia, I would like to welcome you all in this book discussion. My name is Edbert Gani. I'm a researcher here at CSIS in the Department of Politics and Social Change. And I'm very humble to be your moderator for today's interesting discussion. Today, we are very honored to have with us Mr. Ben Bland, the Director of Southeast Asia Program at Lowy Institute, and also the author of the book that we want to discuss today, of course. Welcome, Pak Ben. Selamat siang. Thank you for joining us again. And Ben will share with us his newly published book with the title Man of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia. This book, as we know, has attracted so much attention recently, as we can find already some reviews circulating around from renowned scholars and also foreign observers of Indonesian politics. The book itself has claimed to be the first English language biography or political biography of Joko Widodo. Me myself enjoy reading the book as an easy run through of Jokowi's course to power. And however, the book has taken not only praises but also criticisms. So I expect an exciting discussion today as we have our Indonesian scholars and political scientists here with us. So maybe there's some critics or maybe praises for the book today. Apart from the criticism, I believe this book is very timely as we are in the middle of a pandemic, which most of us believe that at this critical juncture, the government's performance has been put under scrutiny. Hence, the book easily gets people to read, especially with a very inviting title, with the word of contradiction. Although, as I quote Marcus Mitzner, a political scientist, that diagnosing contradictions is banal for any politician. Ben puts the handling of COVID-19 in Indonesia as his most serious critics towards the figure he wrote, of course, Pak Jokowi. And I also want to quote Thomas Pepinski's review on the book, that he said Ben focuses not just on the outcomes, but also on the policy process itself. And I think that's a very important highlights that I would like to give the discussion to elaborate more. Here we are also very humble to have our three distinguished discussants. First, we have Pak Djayadi Hanan, a political scientist and also political science lecturer at Paramadina University, and the Executive Director of Lembaga Survei Indonesia. Terima kasih Pak Djayadi, Mas Djayadi sudah bergabung bersama kami. Secondly, we have Ibu Amalinda Savirani. Dr. Amalinda, she is currently the head of the Department of Politics and Government in Gadjah Mada University. And last but not least, we have Mr. Philips Vermonte, our Executive Director here at CSIS Indonesia. Before we start, I'd like to encourage you, the audience, to drop your questions in the Q&A section below on your Zoom. Or you could also put your questions through the comment sections on YouTube if you watch this seminar or webinar using that platform. And please to write down your name and affiliation if you have comments or questions. So without further ado, I would like Pak Ben, Mr. Ben, to start his presentation. Ben, time is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the kind introduction, and yeah, very humbled to be here discussing my thoughts with such an esteemed panel of people I learned so much from over the years. So thanks again to you all for hosting me. Really appreciate it. I'll just start with a very brief presentation. Okay. So I'm not going to seek to give a summary of my book. That would be boring and it's too complex. This is really a narrative book. It's a political biography. It's trying to tell a story. It's trying to get people interested in Indonesia, interested in Jokowi's leadership, and trying to look at it from the early days to where he is now and make some sense of, I think, what's been a very sort of fascinating but confusing time. I know some people like my book, some people hate my book. Some people have said it's banal. Some people have said it's, dikritik, habis-habisan, merciless criticism of the government. I've had my own fake news memes in Indonesia. The book's been circulating in pirated form on WhatsApp. So lots of contradictory responses to it, which I think is fitting for the theme. So I'm just going to sketch out a few ideas about why I'm talking about contradictions in Jokowi's leadership and hopefully provoke some more debate, which was really the object of my short book. And the Penguin Special series is really a series of short reads that are designed to make people think afresh about a subject or give a slightly different take. So that's really what I was trying to do with the book and what I'll try and do briefly today. So who is Jokowi? You all know this. I'm not going to go through this again, only to remark very briefly that when we think about Jokowi's short time in politics, he's now spent 40% of his political career as president. And very soon, in a few years, he'll have spent more time as president than he spent in politics before the presidency. So I think we have to remember, while he's such a familiar figure in the presidential palace and even on the world stage, really, he's been on the political scene for such a short period of time. And so much of that increasingly is in the top job. And I think it's easy to forget just how quickly he came from being a furniture maker in Surakarta and Solo to being the president of Indonesia. And I think that sharp rise really defines Jokowi in lots of ways, which I'll talk about shortly. So what kind of leader is Jokowi? That's really the question I was trying to ask and trying to answer during the book, but also when I was a correspondent in Indonesia for the Financial Times and covering Indonesia from outside for the Lowy Institute as well over the last few years since first meeting the president in 2012. I thought he was a fascinating figure. Back then, during the Jakarta gubernatorial election race, you could feel his energy, the way he electrified the campaign against Fuzzy Bowo without really saying much. He's a man of action, not a man of words. And he had this ability to really connect with voters, which I thought was amazing. It's something that so many politicians in Indonesia, in Australia, everywhere, wish they had, and very few have that genuine connection. So I was always fascinated by him from my first meeting, and then watching how quickly he rose from when I first met him to just 2 years later, he was president of Indonesia. And I think many academics, researchers at think tanks like us, journalists, investors have tried to label Jokowi, as human beings, but especially as analysts. We love to put simple labels, overarching frameworks on people to explain things. And there's been a search to do that. And I tried to do it in my book, but it was really hard to come up with one label or one framework that really stuck. So what sort of leader is Jokowi? There are many different ways to look at him. I think one of the first labels you can think about is the reformer. Many people, especially in his early days in Jakarta, and then when he was running for the presidency the first time, but even during his re-election campaign, both inside and outside Indonesia, framed Jokowi as a reformer. And I think this has slightly different connotations inside the country and outside. I think outside, the sense of reform was really around the economy, opening up Indonesia to foreign capital, driving efficiencies in the domestic economy, and to a certain extent, democratic reform. I think within Indonesia, the idea of reform was much more about reforming the political scene, cleaning up corruption, taking power away from the established elites, bringing the balance of power back towards the people. And as Eko Sulistyo, who was in the Kantor Staf Presiden, as an advisor on dealing with NGOs and community organizations, as he put it, he argued that Jokowi was struggling alone to remove the octopus of oligarchy that had been strangling Indonesia. So two different views of reform, I think, but that's one way of looking at him. It has its limitations, as we'll get onto in a second. Jokowi was also, of course, for many people inside and out, and for many still is, a new hope for Indonesian democracy, as this Time magazine cover shows. And one funny story from the book, Jokowi once told me how not long after he'd been elected as president, he'd had a lot of problems with the DPR, with politicians pushing back. And bit by bit, he managed to pull them on side. And he told me how one day Fadli Zon came to see him with a cover of this Time magazine and asked him to sign it. And that for Jokowi was a sign that he was getting a handle on how to manage the difficult elite politics of Indonesia. So we know that in Jokowi's manifesto in 2014, he made some claims about wider reform, democratic reforms in Indonesia, and many people outside saw Jokowi as this new hope for democracy in Indonesia because of his background story and because of the way he allowed himself to be presented, I think, by many civil society organizations and activists as a figure who would transform Indonesia. And it very much plays into this idea outside Indonesia of Indonesia being a beacon of democracy, as I think Barack Obama called it, and Malcolm Turnbull, David Cameron, many other world leaders repeat this line, really a cliche, and Jokowi kind of embodied that at least for a while. The pragmatist. It's another way people think about Jokowi. He is a practical guy. He's a former furniture maker. He wants to find solutions that work. He's not focused on ideology. He's focused on outcomes and getting things moving. He's a political survivor. He's someone driven by his experience of business, of being a mayor, of practical solutions. So that's another way Jokowi is talked about in the research community and in the media. Or the technocrat, linked to pragmatist, but slightly different in the sense that I think technocrat implies a much more closer focus on the details. Michael Hathaway wrote this book about political representation in Indonesia, and he kind of highlights Jokowi as one of this new cohort of leaders emerging through local government directly elected positions in Indonesia, going to the people, doing the sort of blusukan thing, listening to what they want, finding practical solutions to improve governance, to improve access to health and education, to improve the functioning of the bureaucracy as it serves both people and business community. But I think this is a slightly problematic view for me, because Jokowi is someone who's much more guided by his experience than by experts or expertise. In that sense, pragmatist or even technocrat, I don't think really gets to his instinctive politics. This is the politics of a man who feels and sees and does, not a man who reads and thinks and considers so much. So I think the technocrat, there's something in it, not quite right either. So what else do we have? Again, there's sort of a progression here. You can see the developmentalist. This, of course, is the idea that Jokowi, above all else, is focused on developing the Indonesian economy, driving economic growth, building infrastructure. And there's obviously a lot here. We know he has had this strong focus on pushing economic growth ahead, on building out the infrastructure that wasn't really built during the good days of economic growth, fueled by high commodity prices under SBA. And this obviously has mirrors of Suharto, I think, in this concept of developmentalism, which is interesting. But what I would say here, that the limits of this label, if you like, are that Jokowi doesn't really have the focus, the laser-like focus that Suharto sometimes had, but certainly Suharto's advisors, the Berkeley Mafia, etc., really had that focus on the details, on getting things done. Whereas Jokowi has always picked these much broader cabinets of, as I've called it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, that to me bear much more in similarity to Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's cabinets, with some good technocrats in the mix, but not a total reliance on them. So Jokowi really hasn't had the focus on policy in a detailed sense that I think you could call developmentalist. And as one economist joked to me, Jokowi is also not authoritarian enough to be a true developmentalist. So he hasn't had that clear, concerted industrial policy and that kind of iron fist on control that you need to drive true developmentalism. So is Jokowi a populist? Now, populism, I have to say, has got to be one of the most overused words in our current political debate all around the world. Overused, I think, to the point where it's starting to lose all meaning. But it's interesting. There's clearly something there for Jokowi. He does frame himself, particularly in how he looks and how he acts. I would say more than what he says. He frames himself as someone with a unique connection to the people of Indonesia. And it was clearly that connection, or what I would call, his retail political talent, that allowed him to go from nowhere to the presidential palace and to be re-elected with an increased margin. So there is something about, as he puts it, his Wajah Kampung, the fact that he connects with Indonesian people, and he's able to play that up. And that, I guess that's a sort of populism, but Jokowi lacks many of the characteristics of what political scientists would normally view a populist as having. So, for example, Jokowi doesn't pitch himself as being the unique representative of the will of the people. He rarely presents himself like that in the way that a Trump or a Duterte might. Jokowi also doesn't use the divisive language most of the time that the Trumps, the Dutertes, the Bolsonaros of this world do. He has a much more soft, humble, Javanese, you might say, approach, which really doesn't reflect populism elsewhere as it's commonly understood. And the last important difference here, I'd say, is that Jokowi doesn't pitch himself against the elite explicitly. Of course, he pitches himself as being on the side of the people and being like the people, but when you track his career in Solo as mayor and in Jakarta as governor, even before the presidency, Jokowi always worked with the established powers that be. Jokowi himself told me in an interview in Solo, it took him 3 years to win the trust of the civil servants in the city hall. So he didn't go in there, turn over the tables, shake everything up. He was an incremental guy who worked slowly to win people's trust. And while he's worked with representatives of civil society, representatives of Ojek Drivers Association, ethnic groups, whatever, he also worked with business associations, with elite political parties, with Prabowo and Megawati, who helped make him who he was in Jakarta in 2012. So I think actually this focus on elite politics is nothing new. It's always been there for Jokowi since the first election campaign, when we must remember he was already a US dollar millionaire, albeit a small provincial businessman. He'd done well for himself. So populist, again, some truth in it, doesn't quite tell the full story. So nationalism, is Jokowi a nationalist? Well, I think on economic policy, if you look at what he's done in terms of increasing the role of state-owned enterprises, the nationalization of key oil and gas and mining resources, Freeport, Newmont, the Mahakam block of Total, you can see economic nationalism there. If you read his speeches to the Indonesian public about the need for Indonesia to stand on its own 2 feet, reduce reliance on imports, there's economic nationalism there, which stands in stark contrast to how Jokowi presents himself at APEC, at G20, at these international business fora. So there's something there. Some people also point to Jokowi's unilateralism on things like the executions of foreign drug traffickers early on in his presidency. But actually, I think if you look at the bigger picture, there's not much difference here from the SBY years. This economic nationalism, to a certain extent, the willingness to execute the death penalty at certain times and then have a de facto but quiet moratorium at others. Actually, a lot of similarity. So some truth and some limitations to this one too. And just finally, I guess, the authoritarian. This is really the idea pushed very strongly by a lot of colleagues at the Australian National University. They've obviously written a fantastic book coming out of their Indonesia update of last year, just published by CSIS, which I urge everyone to read. Really fantastic insights there from all those scholars and practitioners. Again, I think there's something in it. Clearly, there's been increasing pressure in the last few years on minority rights in Indonesia, on the powers of the KPK. There's been increasing pressure on government critics. We've seen Jokowi looking to the military, the TNI, to do more and more, whether it's helping distribute fertilizer, build food estates, or helping to tackle the COVID-19 crisis. But I see this more, again, in instinctive or pragmatic terms, that Jokowi is looking for the levers of power that work. And there's still a lot of authoritarian institutions, a lot of authoritarian thinking in Indonesian politics, partly to do with kind of reform not really being completed, I think, after the 1998 fall of Suharto. So again, there's clearly something here, but I think there's limits to this framing, because I don't think Jokowi is an authoritarian wolf in democratic sheep's clothing. I think he's just a guy who's focused on the economy. He once told me that he thinks democracy is improving people's lives. He doesn't think about the separation of powers, the power of the anti-corruption agency. He sees things in much more practical terms. So with all these labels, I'd say, I think there is use in all of them in this search for describing Jokowi, for terminology, but there's also limitations. And that's why through my process of my research, talking to the president, talking to many, many people who worked with him as advisors, as ministers, as political backers, as volunteers, I came up with the idea that he's just a very contradictory leader. Of course, humans are all contradictory, but so much of academia is about, and think tank research and journalism is about the search for these overarching frameworks. And I think my own training as a historian taught me always to be skeptical of that, to understand the role of contingency, of ambiguity, which is really Jokowi. He is a man of many costumes, as you see here. That's why I'm wearing this jacket, if you haven't realized. I was inspired to buy this nice Zara jacket by Jokowi, putting it on one day and causing a political storm across Indonesia and a boost in sales for Zara. But Jokowi, just like he loves to wear different uniforms, he's a guy who people put their hopes and dreams and fears onto. As one of his advisors said in the early days to me, he's not like Obama in many senses. I don't think it's a good comparison, but there's one sense in which he is. And Obama said early on that he was like a blank canvas, and he allowed people to hope to paint their hopes and dreams onto him. And I think Jokowi has really done that. He has all these different sides to him in a sense, because he doesn't really have any ideology. He doesn't have any fixed positions. He's using his instincts, his experience to find the best way forward, seeking, as Jan Nugroho, one of his advisors, said to me the other day, seeking political settlement, not necessarily policy solutions for Indonesia's problems, because Jokowi is a guy who relies on personalities, not processes. And we see that with the COVID task force. We see that with his reliance on Luhut Panjaitan and Erick Thohir. They're not in powerful positions because of their job titles as coordinating Minister of Maritime Affairs and Minister of State-Owned Enterprises. In fact, if you looked at the Indonesian government organizational chart, you'd be utterly confused about where the real centers of power lie, because Jokowi relies on the people he gets on with. And we also know that that's changed over time, that his favorites sometime, like Anies Baswedan, Ignatius Jonan, Susi Pujastuti, they've sometimes moved close to Jokowi and then moved away from him, and he's got rid of them. So people are always coming in and out of focus, which is why I think technocrat, pragmatist doesn't quite work, because Jokowi is much more instinctive and experience-driven, and ultimately a very contradictory guy. So just to lay out here a few of what I think are the key paradoxes of Jokowi's leadership. We do know that he rose to power so quickly, and he stayed in power because of his outsider image, which we know has truth. He comes from humble origins. He's a self-made man, but he's now become obviously a consummate transactional elite politician with 3/4 of the DPR behind him, with his son and son-in-law following him into politics. So there's this great tension there. Jokowi was forged as a good leader by competitive electoral politics. The fact that he had to contest not just for the mayoralty of Solo, but even for the nomination from PDIP back in 2004 and 5. But now his son is basically being given a coronation, it looks like, if the elections go ahead. So there's this great tension there. We also see the tension between the idea that Jokowi is a master of micromanagement. This is the sort of technocrat idea. Jokowi's blusukan, go to the ground, ask people what they want, find a solution. But on the other hand, he's a very impulsive, instinctive politician. We see that with the whole idea to push the capital, to move the capital to Kalimantan. It wasn't very well thought through. There was a lot of resistance in the cabinet and from Jokowi's advisors, but it was really an instinctive, impulsive decision. And that grates against this idea that he's a technocrat. And I think we've seen that tension play out during his handling of the COVID-19 crisis. Again, with the idea that Jokowi is a reformer. Actually, as much as he's a reformer, I would argue he's a small c conservative, because he's an incrementalist. He works with the powers that be. He doesn't seek radical change. Jokowi, again, the next paradox, I'd say, he's the greatest electoral champion that Indonesia has ever seen. He's used the free and fair elections that I was lucky enough to monitor on the ground on many occasions to go from nowhere to the most powerful job in Indonesia. But at the same time, he's been a poor guardian of democratic practice in Indonesia. And just lastly, I'd say Jokowi has been incredibly talented and skilled at concentrating power, at bringing the DPR behind him, building a broad coalition, bringing media tycoons, business owners, mass organizations behind him, good at concentrating power, amassing political capital, but very bad at spending it. On so many occasions when Jokowi has had even small degrees of opposition to things he's proposed, he's stepped back from it. So fascinating paradoxes, which I think really embody these deeper contradictions of Indonesia's history as a country which is only 75 years young, made out of the arbitrary limits of Dutch colonial exploitation, a country which, is, as you guys all know, but people outside don't often understand, has defied many of its critics, defied a lot of fears about Indonesia breaking up. It's come through so many trials and tribulations to be an amazing success story in many respects. But still, to my mind, trying to find answers to these fundamental questions, which really date back to 1945, the push and pull between democracy and authoritarianism. We see that recently with Jokowi echoing a lot of the New Order talk about, oppositional democracy, liberal democracy not being appropriate for Indonesia, which has democracy gotong royong with no opposition. We see that in the push and pull between protectionism and economic nationalism and Indonesia's need for foreign capital and foreign expertise to drive economic growth. Again, this dates back to the debates of Indonesia's founders in 1945. The same with the tension between Islam and pluralism. And also, lastly, between the international ambitions for Indonesia to step up on the world stage and be an influential power, and the reality of so much of the focus of the security community is on in spheres of internal breakup and keeping Indonesia together. So I think Jokowi's own paradoxes reflect these greater contradictions in Indonesia. And I just find this a more helpful way to understand the country, rather than the sense, which you get so often from the media coverage, from the literature, that Indonesia is about to be the next sort of economic collapse, or Indonesia is about to be the next China. The idea that Indonesia will be the next Syria and the Islamists will take over, as against the idea that Indonesia is some sort of beacon of tolerance. Again, Indonesia is somewhere in the middle, fighting between these tensions, and Jokowi himself, a contradictory man, is trying to find a way forward while trying to answer, but not really finding any clear answers to these very difficult questions, which I think troubled previous administrations much in the way they did Jokowi. So rounding up now, I think there's a great quote from Benedict Anderson, which to some extent, I think, really gets to the heart of Jokowi. So he talked about the Javanese tradition of political thought, emphasizing power's concentration, not its use, which really mirrors Jokowi, I think, the guy who amasses political capital, but rarely seems to spend it. And Ben Anderson said that the most obvious sign of the man of power is his ability to absorb power from the outside and to concentrate within himself apparently antagonistic opposites, which really, for me, gets to the heart of this idea of a man of contradictions. I think there's definitely something there. I would say I don't like cultural essentialism. I don't think all of Indonesia can be explained by Javanese-ness, and I also groan when people mention Wayang and the like. So I think there are limits to this view of thinking, but it'd be silly to imagine that Indonesia's culture doesn't affect its politics. So I'll leave you with one question here, which is, when Jokowi, for example, brought Prabowo into his cabinet last year, was this a Javanese move to absorb Prabowo's power into his cabinet? Or was this really practical politics, trying to neutralize a dangerous opponent and pull him away from some of the hardline Islamist groups he'd been associated with? So there's contradictory ways to look at this. And I think we also see these contradictions in Jokowi's handling of COVID-19, where many of the flaws and the weaknesses I've highlighted today have become evident. His lack of trust in civil society, an impatience, I think, with listening to experts and complicated explanations, a focus on tactics over strategy, a reliance on the military and the police to get things done, rather than listening to a broader range of policymakers for solutions. So if you talk to Indonesian political scientists, epidemiologists, they'll be extremely, extremely critical of Jokowi's handling of COVID-19. But what I think is interesting and very contradictory is if you ask, I'm sure, Djayadi and look at surveys, Jokowi remains remarkably popular despite this criticism, despite what's being presented as a total mismanagement of COVID-19. The Indonesian people, Indonesian electorate, still seem to see him as the right leader for the moment. So again, one last contradiction to leave you with for today. Thanks a lot for listening. I hope it's been helpful and looking forward to a really interesting discussion. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Ben, for the elaboration of your points from your book. I would like to encourage the participants, the audience, to put your questions in the Q&A section below. And also, if you want to write down your question in Bahasa, in Indonesian language, you can also put it there. And our team will translate it and will deliver it to the panelists. So right now, I would like to move to the first discussion. I would give the time for Mr. Djayadi Hanan. You will be our first discussion to give comments or maybe critics, I don't know, to Ben Bland's book. Pak Djayadi, time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Gani. Good morning. Rather almost afternoon, yeah, almost noon, everyone. May I have a question? How much time do I have? 10 minutes? 15?
10 minutes.
Okay.
If that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try.
Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you to CSIS to invite me again in this important occasion. And I think the first comment I would like to make is that I would like to join others in congratulating Ben, our longtime friend, I would say, if you don't mind, for the publication of the book. And as Gani has mentioned, that this book has been attracted a lot of attention in Indonesia and also worldwide. And mentioned by Gani that there are at least 3 English language review of these books from highly renowned scholars, from Ed Aspinall and then Marcus Mitzner and also Tom Pepinski. So I think the fact that this book is attracted a lot of attention is speaking for itself. Maybe because of at least 2 reasons. One is because of the man that is being part of being the center of the story of the book by Ben, and also because of the way Ben is telling the story. Yeah, I think Ben's book is not the first foreign language biography of Jokowi. In 2015, I got one book from China, Professor Su Lipeng from Peking University. He wrote the sort of biography in Chinese language and then translated into Bahasa Indonesia by Ignatius Wibowo. And I think in general, it is quite different from what Ben is saying. Jokowi is, just you said, is getting a lot of praises there as the reformer, as somebody who is gonna revolutionize Indonesian politics and so on and so forth. Yeah, in a way, it is a praise for Jokowi. So again, congratulations to Ben. Number 2, my point is that I think Ben, I guess, also is aware about this, that portraying a political leader as a man of contradiction is not unusual, actually. I mean, Ben is not alone in portraying a political leader as a man of contradiction. For instance, a very famous biographer and also political scientist from the United States, James McGregor Burns, who wrote a very long 2 volumes biography of Roosevelt. He also portrayed Roosevelt as a kind of man of contradiction. For instance, in the preface of his book, Roosevelt, the Soldier of Freedom, Burns wrote that Roosevelt was a deeply divided man, divided between the man of principle, of ideas, of faith, crusading force, a distant vision on the one hand, and on the other, the man of real politics, of prudence, of narrow, manageable, and short-run goals, intent always on protecting his power and authority in a world of shifting modes and capricious fortune. So I think it is a kind of similar to the general assessment put by Ben in this book. So, but I think the three most important things when portraying a man of contradiction in a political biography, I think is that number one is what we mean by that contradiction. And I think Ben mentioned it quite clearly, that it is about everything. It can be between two policies that are done in the same time, that is opposite, they are opposing to with each other, or the difference between the rhetoric and the substance, the inconsistency, and so on and so on and so forth. And all of this contradiction, as Ben has said, is situated in the contradicting Indonesia, between democracy and authoritarian, between, let's say, Islam and pluralism. We have to be a bit careful using that word. And then between openness and protectionism, and between international ambition and internal security. So that's I think the point that needs to be clarified. And I think Ben has done quite a good job in doing so. But I think there is another thing we need to explain also. What are actually the source of that contradictions? What are the sources of those contradictions? Is it in the man, or is it in the environment or institutions that are surrounding the man? I think Ben answered it halfway. In my view, Ben, you answered that that the contradiction of Jokowi is embodied in the contradictions of Indonesia in general, between authoritarianism and democracy, and so on and so forth. But the question, my question is he inside himself is having that contradiction? For instance, like Roosevelt, for instance, he has a vision, but at the same time he found the real politics contradict his vision, and so on and so forth. I think that that was the one that I'm looking for, but so far I don't find it quite satisfactory. But I actually can understand, because this is a very short book, but but Ben is very ambitious to covering all of those contradictions. So I'm thinking that Ben is not done with this book, right? I think he's gonna do more to be maybe even writing a longer book. So those are the second point I would like to make about the contradiction. The third point is that, again, Ben, I'm trained as a political scientist. I'm a student of politics. As you have mentioned, we would like to find what are the frameworks that is good to understand this contradiction, right? So I think there are at least 4 frameworks that I can use to understand Jokowi. Number one is that he is actually, I don't know whether this is similar to the level of pragmatism or not, but I think the man is a rational, calculative politician who is trying to make the most out of the institutions and the environment around him. So whenever it is politically beneficial for him to be a bit on the side of the authoritarianism, he would do that. But at the same time, or at a different time, if it is more beneficial politically for him to be on the side of democracy, then he would do so. So by using that kind of framework, I think I don't think there is a contradiction there. Yeah, that is number one. My time is very short. of course, this what is the question is how does he calculate that it is beneficial or not beneficial, right? Here we have to understand what is his goal. What is his goal? And Ben, I think very often, I think in the book said that this is the man of very deep economic concern with his own definition of economy. So he is trying to link the environment surrounds him with that goals. I will touch further that issue later on. For instance, he or his team, projected that he is really a transparent, no vested interest in doing politics, no family politics. When his daughter was not able to enter to pass the test of being the Indonesian civil servant, right? That was in his first term, but contradicted that to the current one in Pilkada 2020. Yeah, he said at the beginning he's not for family or politics, but now he suddenly jumped to the other end of the spectrum, right? So that from this perspective of rational calculative politicians is, I think we have to understand in which term he was at the time. He was in the first term. Other than economy, beside economy, his other main concern, politically speaking, is to be re-elected, for instance, right? So he needs to concern about that. Then that's why he needs to project to the people that he is the man of no family politics. And I think this is related to the second approach I would like to use in understanding the leadership of Jokowi, is that this is his story is an evolution of a person and a leader. I think Ben also touched this a little bit. That the politics, according to Ben, has revealed the man, revealed himself, right? About his true nature and his true skin and so on and so forth. So I think we can also use this approach, that this is an evolution of a man, a person, and a leader. Let's say from a city person born in Solo to a furniture maker. It is not difficult. It is not easy during Suharto era from a very ordinary person to be a successful furniture maker, even at the level of small city like Solo, right? So it's not easy at the time. So that's telling us something, that there is something in this person during that time, both because of his environment or because of himself. From the city person to furniture maker to mayor to governor and then the president. And I think during his presidency, we can also put an evolution from the first term to the second term. We will see more from the man of the people to the man of the elites, for instance. So this is an evolution of the man. Then because of that evolution, then we will see contradiction in one way or another if we don't put it in that kind of evolutionary types of approach. And number three, I guess, is that this is a person who is concerned and passionate mostly about economy. So anything that will halt his ambition in building quote unquote economy will be sidelined. I think this kind of approach, for instance, can explain to us why at the beginning of the pandemic he played down the pandemic. I think it is not only Terawan did that, but he himself embraced the idea that we have to play down this pandemic. Why is that? I think part of the reason is because this pandemic will, not only halt the economy, but also made a lot of his economic plan cannot be executed. So, but along the way, then he realized that he cannot do that anymore. So we see some kind of inconsistency and contradiction there. And the last one, I think, this is the last point that you made, Ben. This is a Japanese person using a Japanese culture in approaching politics, in approaching day-to-day life, and so on and so forth. But I think the question is he really that kind of Japanese culture, types of person? Given that he was born in a modern family, in a modern hospital, for instance, not like Suharto, who was born in Kamusu, very remote area in Yogyakarta, with deep-rooted poverty there, and so on and so forth. So, but I think Ben used several, if not many, Japanese cliches, right? In your book, like menang tanpa ngasorake, or winning without humiliating. So those are actually my, let's say, my next point. And okay, I'm running out of time. The last point I would like to make, and I think this is, I am aware that this might be doesn't do fairness to Ben, because I think although Ben seems to me deliberately choose to write a very short political biography, right? That is, while me as a student of Indonesian politics, I of course, reading your book, I expected more. For instance, I want a bit thicker description, which can reveal the true value that is embraced by this man. For instance, when a lot of moments, I think, can be dig further by us to understand the true value that is embraced by this man. For instance, during the 212 movement moment, right? So I think it will be very interesting to see what kind of advice he is getting, what kind of data he is presented with, who are counseling with him, what kind of choices that he was facing at the time, what kind of risk that he was calculating, and then then he decided, I went out and see the protesters, for instance. So that will, I think, in a way, can reveal the true value of this man when presenting with that kind of very important critical moment. Because what could you do as a politician, as a leader at the time, when you deal with that very important crisis, that kind of crisis? Because either way, you will be disappointing a lot of people, and in a way can be a disaster. Your decision can be a disastrous for the nation, for instance. So, but if that a lot of things also, I think, needs to be dig further, like his childhood, for instance, right? And then who helped him actually in being a successful furniture? Who, what is actually happening when he decided to run for the mayor of Solo, and so on and so forth? That will help us understand more about what is the true value, the true vision, the true judgment of this man this man that we are discussing today. Other than that, again, Ben, congratulations. I praise your work, and I think the other strengths of the books that Ben has been writing is that because you have been interviewing the man firsthand, and quite in quite a long period of time, and also quite a lot of interviews. So I think that I find it I find many of your assessment based on your interviews are very insightful, and that I think should be commend the praise for you. Thank you, Ben,
Thank
and
you.
thank you, Penny.
Thank you, Jayadi, for your brief comments and also important notes. I already wrote down some of the interesting comments from Mr. Jayadi that I would like Ben later to comment about it. So I would like to move on to our second discussion, Ibu Amalinda Savirani. Time is yours.
Thank you, Mas Gani. Can I share my screen?
Yes, of course. We already allow every panelist to share the screen.
Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
The screen?
Yep, clearly.
Okay, thank you so much, CSIS, for the invitation, and I'm so honored to join this book discussion, and on this a very important, timely book. I give a title on this presentations, "The Story of Confusing Gepetto." Maybe all of you familiar with, because it really very much relate with the furniture makers, and as well as we know that last year the Tempo magazine, having this cover, but just struck me directly on this home furniture makers that I think Ben very much emphasized in the first and second chapter. So that will be, I'm not going to tell a story on children books at this occasion, but just to give the way I read the book and how I can relate it very, very much to the story of Pinocchio and Geppetto. First, congratulations, Ben. It's a very, I think, I must say, I agree with the point that Mas Bang Jayadi also mentioned, how chronological the book is, how it is easy to follow, and you can quickly finish it. And I can imagine that those who will read this book, perhaps a very beginner of Indonesian politics, the book will be sold at the Periplus, and then before you go to the plane. Of course, it's not the case anymore right now during the pandemic. But I can imagine halfway through on your way to your destination, you already finished, and you will have a kind of rough idea on the. But I just want to very much focus on there's also another book focusing on the history of the Jokowi from his background in the working class family furniture makers, right? My colleague Wawan Masudi wrote a dissertation on this in University of Melbourne a couple of years ago, and very much into this explanation on the way Jokowi get legitimacy for his leadership. And then it followed by the book that I show in this presentation, in this slide, from Kali Anyar to, it's about the vertical mobility. That's something I want to also address in this discussion, very much relate to what Bang Jayadi has mentioned about the question on why. What's the explanation of these contradictions? Isn't it all the Indonesian leaders experience this at the same times? And I also offered some of the perhaps explanation or just suggestion that I think implicitly already in your book, but I'm also trained as a political scientist, and I cannot help to really wonder. So what is it? Why this is the case, and to what extent it also become a model or a pathway of Indonesian leadership in the future, right? I think it's very important to situate it in this book, and then to connect that with the route or pathway of leadership in Indonesia future, which is very much, I don't know whether this is also can be a one model or not. So this is the Gepetto, we call it Gepetto, or in English it's Gepetto, but it's very much, you bring this throughout of your stories, how the history of Jokowi being brought up in the working class family, as a furniture makers in Central Java, and how how it influenced the way he see politics and the way he developed leadership. I don't mean to insult the president, but I just want to say how, and I don't want to be labeled as in Tempo magazine as well, like we had last year, of insulting the president. But I just see the parallelity of the way chapter 1 mentioned about this history of the president, the way he brought up and the way he really worked hard on developing his business, and the way it is very much influenced the way he see things during his presidency. So that brings me also to another issues. You mentioned in the very important argument in your book is also very much on the contradiction, as you show us before in your presentation, which I think really show a very extreme degree of contradiction, in so many aspects, as you show us in your presentation of this contradiction. But if I come back to your chapter 3 definition, you said that this is the way you define it is between his call to expand foreign investment and protectionist instinct, between his professed mastery of micromanagement and his capricious nature, and between his desire to streamline bureaucracy and his unwillingness to upset the established order. That's your definition of contradiction in the last page of chapter 3. So it's also argument, you bring along this argument all the way from in your book, and then very much in chapters 4, 5, and 6, you specifically elaborate that in the arena of economic, politics, and foreign affairs during his leadership. But the question is again, I share Bang Djayadi concern and questions why these contradictions? What kind of main explanation of your argument in this book? And again, I wonder whether we can also learn from your book by identifying whether this is another model of trajectory of Indonesian leadership in the future. Because we know that all this time, over the course of the history, we always have this elite-related leadership. Either it's from the military, from the bureaucracy, or from the group of business people, right? It has never been a story of the ordinary citizens of Indonesia who somehow, with his own pathway, and he said that, and you also mentioned in your book, nasib, fate that bring him to the become number one of Indonesian politics. So this is going to be my main point in this presentation. So I wonder whether the way I used to Jepeto is very much, I wonder whether it's also about class factors. Are you suggesting that this is a very class thing, this man of contradiction, that try to deal with so many pressure, with so many things going on at the same time? Or is it a personality? Because I somehow feel that maybe I'm wrong in understanding your book, but it seems to me that it's more on the personality, on this history of the future maker that contribute or that explain the way he becomes such a contradiction man during his leadership, right? Because again, while I'm reading your book, I cannot help to think about, is this another way, another model of leadership that Indonesia has at this moment? If it is so, then we will always find this contradiction in the leadership, right? But if it is a class thing, then we have another explanation for that, and it's very interesting too for the way we parties or whatever try to groom the leaders for the future leadership of Indonesia, if we then base our understanding on these different factors. So that's my first why. And my second why is, I share very much what Bang Djayadi. It seems to me that you implicitly mention about these three things, right? First, institutionalizations of electoral democracy and decentralizations, which cause extreme polarization and fragmentation among political actors. The second is on the historical explanation, even though I think the tension between whether you are being open to the market or you're being protectionist has always been in the Indonesian politics since the very after independence. The third is about, and you mentioned actually again implicitly, this political economic explanations. So let me just explore the first one. You mentioned in your presentation that there has been a lot of talking, discussion, debate on this, the way Indonesia or the way Jokowi perceived as new developmentalism leader. And also you mentioned about always these chaotic decisions. And I think, personally, what makes Jokowi different from the new order leadership, which is Suharto, he's a very weak control on the bureaucracy apparatuses, which make it so many, which also explain why many policies somehow, as you said, good intentionally, but very bad in executing it. So there's always this gap, right? I think that's also this environment that Bang Djayadi mentioned, why this is very much the case of this contradiction, because he cannot really have this whole hand on whole bureaucracy, which total about 4 million in Indonesia, even though 60 million are teachers, but I just want to say that this is a big organizations and very much the key of the policy execution, but he has no control of it. Then why? Then I think it's the argument that some colleague at the ANU, including F.R. Burton, said about the new developmentalism is a very much in a very limited way, because I think simply because there is no control of bureaucracy that Jokowi can have in both, as you mentioned in your book, ego sectoral, among ministry and also between national and local government. That's very much my first point. And in general too, I think internationalization of local democracy, internationalization of electoral democracy and decentralization has really created such an extreme polarization and fragmentation of actors, which make it really difficult to manage, and so many interests, so many this and so many that, and make it really hard for him to really have a control. Something that I think relate with my third point on retail politics. Suharto is very much also very retail in a sense, like he's very micro. He knows how to control and how to make sure that his civil servant, all civil servant will vote for him, And if somebody not vote for him, for Golkar at the time, he and his apparatus will know. So that's the way I understand also very much retail politics, in a way of technique of controlling, technique of managing, technique of disciplining citizens, right? And I don't think very much the case in our president right now. So it is indeed a retail politics, but a very much limited as well, because if you compare with the new order, you see such a extreme micro strategies, micro management, which really in terms of control, I mean, that's something that I don't think that's the case in our president right now. So retail politics, I think, is also need to clarify. Otherwise, again, if you connect with the new order, that will be a different type of politics. And the third is about the second is historical explanation. You told us that you are a historian by training, but I wonder many explanation of this contradiction attitude of our president is very much a common pattern in the Indonesian history, particularly on this economic policy. I think I'm sure you're familiar with the book that try to understand the very early economic development in Indonesia post-independence. Glass-Dorner book is very much useful. I think that try to map these two groups, and it's always been the case during Suharto, during the SBY, and now that we have our president. So again, if we look at these historical factors, that all presidents have to deal with it. So then we can also say, at least from the economic perspective, they are all men of contradiction, right? Because they have to struggle with these two poles at the same time, constantly. And then throughout sometimes it's just a different context of a different case that, it's always been ups and downs about this ambiguity and contradiction that all of the Indonesian leader has to face. So that's basically very much my main how to say that. And I cannot help when I read your book, very detailed, chronological, full of quotes, full of your interview data, full of empirical from the spot report, which again very interesting, but it just will be do more justice to the readers if we can also explain explicitly why is that the case. So this is my last PowerPoint. This is actually a context. I think Elizabeth Pisani wrote a very insightful book mentioning that Indonesia is always work in progress, because so many things. It's a country of etc. That has not been finished, that still need to complete. And it make me think like, isn't it? Will it any leaders of Indonesia seems to will deal with these contradictions, because they have so many unfinished business since our independence 75 years ago. So I think the man of contradiction seems to me will be naturally the case for all of our president. But perhaps what I can get from your book is a very extreme contradiction that we find in our president, seventh president, and perhaps so it's about the explanation of history and also the environment that Bang Jayadi mentioned, and one is institutional. So I think I finished there, I closed there, and again, congratulations for your book, Ben. And I hope to have a more discussion on this. Thank you, Mas Gani.
Thank you very much, Bu Linda, for your kind examination from Ben's book. I just want to report for the panelists that we have already around 300 of participants for this discussion. So I think Ben's book is where we have so much attention from Indonesian citizens and academia. And we already have a bunch of questions, and I try my best to pick the best one because our time is limited. So for now, I just want to move on to Mr. Philip Vermonte to give his thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Gani. Hi, Ben. Congratulations on your book. And I have a fun time reading this book that you call the first English language political biography of Jokowi. And I agree with Djayadi. Actually, there was a book published in 2015 by this scholar in China, Xu Liping. But I'm not lucky enough to get the translated version. It's all in Mandarin, so I could not read it. Jayadi, I might borrow the book from you. But also, at least there's one dissertation on President Jokowi as from the University of Melbourne, as Linda already mentioned. Now, I have some points to make regarding the book. Number one, I think Indonesia and President Jokowi is a moving target. They are all moving target. We are decentralizing, and President Jokowi is still just started his actually second term. And then the book specifically, I think Ben took a stab on COVID-19 and how Jokowi handled. It's a reflection of this contradiction that you mentioned. Now, if I may start with the context of, I think, Jokowi's presidency and Indonesia's democracy right now. Number one, President Jokowi is the first democratically elected civilian president in Indonesia. I think in itself, it's very important to remember. Megawati was a civilian, but she was not elected through election. She won the election, but then because of the political acrobats within the DPR, Gus Dur, a civilian, another civilian, became the president, but then he was then replaced by President Megawati. So this is the very first context that we need to remember. Secondly, as you noted in your book, he's also the first outsider, quote unquote, to be elected, which I think in this context we have to remember, being the outsider, Jokowi does not have access, let alone initial access, let alone control over political machinery of the political parties in Indonesia. And as we know, in the presidential politics in Indonesia, fortunately or unfortunately, political parties are the main actor in terms of nominating and so on and so forth. The third context, though, he is the direct product of Indonesia's decentralization program, ambitious decentralization program. And this is, I think, with regard to the title, struggle to remake Indonesia. I think the fact that he's the product of decentralization, the first elected president as a result of this decentralization, is that nothing more, I think, inspiring and nationalistic than seeing a local leader in Indonesia outside Jakarta can become a president through electoral means. So this is something which is part of the big question of the remaking of Indonesia that we started in 1998. That now we can imagine local leaders, not the insider in Jakarta, can become a president. So now everybody in Indonesia, wherever you are, you can imagine your local leader, if they do a good job, good performance, then they can become a national leader. And I think nothing more nationalistic than that in the context of Indonesia. Now, by nature, I think local leaders then are micromanager because they have to deal with everyday problem. Mayors, governors, they deal with traffic problem, flood, diseases and so on and so public service delivery. So because this is the first time we have a local leader to become a president, of course, by nature, what we will get is a micromanager leader. And the byproduct of this is what you call the ad hoc style of leadership. So I think this is the context. And I think President Jokowi, then when he started his political venture, he used this, he distinguished himself from the national leaders coming from Jakarta, military leaders, and so on, and the elites, and so on. And he's capitalizing the fact that he is someone coming from bottom up. Number 4, the context that we need to remember, I think, is that we have no clean break from the authoritarian past. So that, as you said in your book, the authoritarian past, they would have seats on the table. And this is something then that Jokowi needs to struggle with, not only Jokowi actually, I think civil society and the public in general needs to deal with. So lastly, the context is, as you also mentioned in the book, quoting various studies in Indonesia on party cartelization. And party cartelization is in the background. So you imagine someone with no initial access nor control over the party, then you have to deal with this kind of party cartelization, that power has been absorbed by political parties. So these 5 contexts, I think, affect, the way President Jokowi operates. Now, that's the 5 contexts that I need to highlight. Second part is that contradiction that you focus on the book. There are at least 4 contradictions that you mentioned. Some already mentioned by Linda earlier in her comments on the book. But if I may repeat that, number 1, the first contradiction is between his call to expand foreign market and protectionist instincts. Second contradiction between his professed mastery of micromanagement and his capricious nature. Number 3, between his desire to streamline bureaucracy and his willingness to upset the established order. And lastly, relying on personality rather than processes. So now with the earlier context that I mentioned, this contradiction, is it a matter of personality, like, or is it about institution or structural context of the political setting that he is in, as Mas Djayadi earlier mentioned? I'd like to come back on that point later on. But you provide a very interesting, I think, examples in the book that saying somehow you acknowledge that this is part of the structural problem. You mentioned about the lack of coordinations or ego sectoral, as you put it in the book, lack of coordination across governments, which has not been unique to President Jokowi because it's been there for a long time in Indonesia. Every president, at least since 1998, needs to deal with this lack of coordination across governments, so that policies, no matter how good intention the policies are, cannot be executed. And you mentioned your experience about this new route of ferry from General Santos in Mindanao to Bitung Port in North Sulawesi, and you came back to the site later and you see nothing has been developed. So the policy was well intentioned, but then because of the lack of the government coordination, it cannot be materialized. I also would like to come back on that point later. Now, so I would say this is my second part of the second part of the my comments. I think what happened is not contradiction, but I would say it's more of the dilemma that he has to weigh, in every policies that he needs to make. And because of the presidential system that we have, of course, then the personality of the president might contribute to the successful or failure of the policy implementation. I'd like to give you one example as well. I think reform that he's been trying to make has its own political cost for him as well. And in the first term, like Pak Djayadi mentioned, leading up to the, because he constantly think naturally for re-election. Every president, in first term would also do the same way, thinking about the re-election chance. Now, CSIS had some opportunities to have a one-on-one meeting with him leading up to the 2019 election. He has this, I think, Pak Djayadi for sure has this kind of opportunity as well, because he constantly listening to various polls and public opinion. So at one point, I think pollsters, various pollsters revealed that before the 2019 election, the weakest support for him are from the young age between 19 to 23, and also among civilian public servants, or i.e. the bureaucracies. And so at one point he was asking, why is it the case, right? Why is it the young people as well as civil servant opposed him, at least not giving support for him? And various posters try to explain, and myself included, that this young age, they were probably first fresh graduate looking for jobs, and the economy is not doing very well. Job market limited, and so on and so forth. Because most of us think like we are in Jakarta. If you are a fresh graduate, you want to work in a company, blah 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 blah, right? So we explained that to him, and then the response was very interesting. He said, no, I think, he said, it's because the first thing I did was to freeze the recruitment of new civil servant, because he wanted to reform the civil servant and freeze the recruitment in order to, to get the younger generation of civil servant later on. Now, I think that's the right reading of the psychology of the Indonesians across the country. If you are in Jakarta, maybe we cannot feel this, but I think in Indonesia, the aspirations to become civil servant is still really high, because it provides job security and so on and so forth. So he read that as the cost of political reform that he wanted, but then he lost some support somewhere in between. So then I would say that this is something that I agree with Linda and with Djayadi earlier, that from the reform perspective, I think he is well intentioned, as you mentioned in the book, but the structure that he has to operate, is such a huge obstacle, and I'll come back to this later. The third point in the second part of my comments is about developmentalism that was used to refer to the fact that, as an example that you provided, the example of infrastructure development, because you think, or you quoted, I think some economist, that he's not really interested in the, creating the free market access through infrastructure development, indifferent to economic theory and political theory, but he's just believing that economic growth is necessary to maintain political legitimacy. And I would say, what's wrong with political legitimacy? All president would want, I think, to have political legitimacy from what they are doing. Maybe this is consistent pragmatism from his side, and he's building. But again, pragmatism, maybe something we can read it at the different view as well. He's been, you mentioned in the book, he's been very much concentrating on infrastructure development outside Java. But at the same time, you said Java is the center of economy, of politics in Indonesia. So if he is having electoral pragmatism, he would not do that outside Java. Any pragmatist president would do that in Java, if because it brings you electoral benefit right away. But there are probably other things that he's thinking. constitutional mandate for development and so on, which is not very pragmatic. And he went against all the economists, I think, advising him not to do, for example, building toll road in Papua, from, if you think about it from the economic perspective, it would not, materialize and translate into electoral benefit. But somehow he did that. So saying he's a pragmatist, we may find evidence that sometimes, he is not a pragmatist, but maybe he's doing a larger cause. Now, the last part, I think focusing on personality, although important in the context of presidential system, risk of omitting the structural challenges again in which he has to operate. That includes maybe the state capacity to carry out reform, or the state capacity includes logistical capacity of the state or political authority. And also focusing on personality, we need to think about public scrutiny as well, because these two, state capacity and public scrutiny, I think are very much in Jokowi's mindset when he conducts, reform or development and so on and so forth. And you rightly mentioned that political scientists in Indonesia has been, not only in Indonesia, or those observer about Indonesia, has been in constant struggle to find an overarching framework to explain, President Jokowi, his relative performance and relative legitimacy. And this is something coming out in the CSIS WhatsApp group the other day. My colleague Evan posted a very interesting article from the World Politics Journal, a very recent one, on, and this is probably the likely candidate of this overarching framework that we are searching for. It's about, talking about legitimacy, within authoritarian government or democratic government. We always pit performance legitimacy of authoritarian government. You said Jokowi is not authoritarian enough to do the reform and to do the policies that he's making. We often pit performance legitimacy of authoritarian government against procedural legitimacy of democracy, right? Because procedural legitimacy, you are talking about, public discourse, public discussion about policies, lawmaking, and so on and so forth. But authoritarian government just need to do things right, and then they will get the performance legitimacy. Now, there's this third idea that I think fit perfectly with Jokowi's nature of leadership and presidency. That is performative governance or legitimacy. If we are thinking about, this is coming from an article written by Iza Ding in the World Politics Journal, 4 types of state behavior. And it relates to probably the president behavior or all political actors within the system. Now, if you have, I referred to earlier, state capacity. If you have high state capacity to carry out programs, strong bureaucracy, and so on, in the Weberian sense, and you have a low public scrutiny, then you will have paternalistic state behavior, that state stronger than society. If you have low capacity of the state and low public scrutiny, you have inert state behavior or government. But if you have a high state capacity and high level of public scrutiny, you have substantive, governance. And lastly, if you have low state capacity but high public scrutiny, then you will have performative governance, meaning, can be defined as the theatrical deployment of visual, verbal, and gestural symbols to foster impression of good governance before the public. And because performance is subjective, and you are wondering, you posed 2 questions earlier, that regardless of the disregard of the experts, epidemiologists, and so on, but Mas Djayadi's survey told us that he seems to be still the highly popular president with a high level of approval rating. And because this is subjective, then Pak Jokowi understand very much the psyche of the Indonesian public. Performative governance, because the lack of capacity of the bureaucracy, he know very well. He know the big challenges that he has. So he opt for the performative legitimacy. That's why it is supported by now the social media and so on, buzzers, as we know it in Indonesia, photo ops and so on and so forth. So it creates the impression of successful performative governance, but we are not talking about the substantial, outcome. COVID-19 being one that, regardless of the fact that changes of personnel of the gugus tugas and so on and so forth, flip-flopping on various policies, but still, regardless of the fact that now Indonesia is the country with the largest number of deaths, caused by COVID-19, people are still supporting, have a good impression of his presidency. So I think I'd like to stop my presentation there by saying that we cannot only view President Jokowi from the personality side, but we also need to scrutinize the structural challenges that he has to operate in, and it is a moving target. We have disappointment over his handling of COVID-19. Experts are frustrated. Probably the middle class are frustrated, but somehow, this is a mystery to us that the public in general still throw support behind the president. And I would say probably this is the fact that we are having, that the electorates in Indonesia are still voters who value performative governance more than substantive achievement of governance in Indonesia. And it's a moving target. Historians and probably scholars after 2024 would have something more to write. Thank you.
Thank you, Mas Phillips. I think we are already past our time, so I would like to ask Ben, would you like to answer the comments from the panelists? Do you still have time?
Yeah, I still have time, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe I would like to add another questions from the audience, maybe some question that have not been represented by the panelists, if that's okay?
Yeah, let me respond very quickly to what the three other panelists have said, just very quickly. Thanks all for your comments and insights, really helpful and challenging, which is good. I mean, to be clear, this is a short book. The series is a series of short books. So the format was already limited in the length that I could write. And I really wanted to write something thought-provoking that would promote debate and discussion. So I'm really glad, really touched to see that it has done already, because that was exactly what I wanted to achieve. I was also writing mostly for outsiders, for people who know nothing about Indonesia. So it's really hard when you have to tell the story a priori from its basics, from people who don't know who Jokowi is. But you also want to add some value for the broader community. And when I was talking to the publisher, they said, they kept pressuring me, take that out, take out that name, take out that concept, because they're thinking about the general reader. So there's a tension there, which the more specialized you go, the more you lose the general reader. And my book was really aimed at general book readers outside Indonesia, but I wanted to hopefully add some value and be thought-provoking for experts like yourselves too. So glad to see that it's done that. I totally agree with Mas Phillips. It's a moving target, but I work at a think tank, okay? I'm meant to be relevant to the policy community, to the media, to government, as well as hopefully somewhat to academic community. If I'd waited till 2028, I could have gone back, seen the end of Jokowi's presidency, had access to people who would have been much more open, because he would have left government, maybe sat down with Jokowi for 3 months and discussed it all in his house. But it wouldn't have been relevant to policymakers. The target would have moved to someone else. So I was trying to write a book that would help people understand the president and Indonesia from the outside now. and for the next 4 years of his presidency, which is very difficult to do. But that was what I hoped to do somewhat with a short book. But I agree. Hopefully it's a start for many other people to do more of their own research. And I built on all the great research that people like Wawan Masudi did. I cite his dissertation in my book and many other scholars as well who definitely helped my thinking. But as I said, as a historian, I really think it's about a combination of institutional structure, human agency, and contingency. The sheer randomness, the fact that Jokowi never would have imagined he could be president, but this series of political accidents occurred, which he was able to bend to his will, meant no one could have predicted it. So that's the sense I was trying to communicate in the book. And just the last thing I'd say on, Jokowi, the rational politician, I agree there's a lot of that, but I just think, like Mas Philip said, there's a lot of unpredictable things where Jokowi doesn't do what you think he will do, right? When you think Jokowi will get rid of ministers, like maybe Terawan, he sticks with him. At other times, there are ministers where you think he's close to, and suddenly he cuts them off, like Anies Baswedan, and he ends up with a very strong political opponent. So this idea of contradictions and the unpredictability, that came from ministers, from people close to Jokowi who'd worked with him and just told me, we can't quite get a handle on how to understand him. And in the end, I think that's because, he's risen to power so quickly and he is changing. It is a moving target. So naturally, it's hard to get a handle on that. But those are just some brief comments. But really appreciate all your thoughts and insights. And hopefully, more people will dig deeper into these questions than I can do in just 140 pages.
Thank you, Ben. If I may, I would like to deliver 3 questions from the audience, if you like. The first one is from our fellow, Ibu Puspa Amri. So to the elder and all panelists, had COVID-19 arrived during the president's first term, where he would be very much behaving like an incumbent trying to get re-elected, would we have seen a very different handling of the pandemic? I think this is a very interesting question that I would like Ben to answer. And the second one is from Iqbal Hafizon from Universitas Pajajaran. Based on your research, how does Jokowi understand political stability? Does he look more at the public interests, or is it more inclined towards interest groups such as a coalition of parties or businessmen who provided him political support during the campaign? And the last question I would like you to answer is from Wafa Karisma. So he said, as I have heard from you and the book, can we say that there is a lack of certain, clear, directive core principles in Pak Jokowi's leadership? Is that why it is hard to find some standards to base or measure his actions to? I think these 3 questions have not been represented by the panelists, so I would like you to answer.
Wow. Okay, three hard questions. On the counterfactual question of COVID-19 in his first term, I don't know. I tend to think that, as I write in the book, power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. And I think, as Jokowi has faced harder and harder challenges, we see more what he's like, his strengths, many strengths, and some of his weaknesses too. So I would imagine that you wouldn't see anything that different. That's who knows. But I guess if COVID-19 had struck at any time, he would have responded in a similar way. That's the best guess, because his responses to me have mirrors to other ways he's governed. So that's my best answer to that. On political stability, I think Jokowi is a politician. Political stability means staying in power, winning elections, right? Building a bigger coalition behind him. And I think the problem is that doesn't always mean the same thing as policy stability or policy solutions, but he has been incredibly successful at amassing political power, winning elections, boosting his support base. And I think it's natural for almost any politician who's successful. That's how they stay successful, is by seeing what keeps them in power that day. But obviously, there are other leaders who manage to balance that with a longer strategic focus. But I think Jokowi is very much all about the tactics. That's my sense. And just lastly, to Wafa's question, I think my sense is Jokowi is a guy who rules, who lives through experience. He's not a big reader. He's not a narrative president who gives grandiloquent speeches. He's a guy who's guided by his experience of life, of business, of government as well. So I think that's how he governs. It's not through the principles of politics, it's through his own experience of life. And there I think there is an interesting comparison with how Robert Elson, Suharto's biographer, also from Australia, talked about Suharto as being guided by experience. I think there's a really interesting comparison. You can't push it too far, but I think there's certainly something there. And Jokowi rose to the top so quickly. What else does he have but his experience? But it's also because of who he is, that he's a guy who, I think he puts it himself in his ghost-written autobiography, that he has to see things with his own eyes, not just read the data.
Thank you very much, Ben, for your answer. So I'm sorry because our time is very, very limited. So I would like to close this book discussion. I would like to thank Ben Bland, of course, the author of the book, Pak Djayadi Hanan, Ibu Amalinda Savirani, and Pak Phillips to be the discussants. I hope that this discussion will be followed by another discussion in another area and another events. So I would like to invite all of the participants to give a round of applause for the panelists. Thank you.